Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
I get really cross when I see well-heeled, middle-aged people sneering and criticising young people for doing what young people do.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Chopper to my friends, and this is Chopper's Politics. This week, a coronavirus postcode lottery. The politicians of SW1 announced that everybody in England would now have their freedoms dictated by where they live. And the whole of Parliament agreed that this was an excellent idea. Of course that's not true. This is 2020. Some MPs are questioning the impact of these restrictions on the economy. Others are calling for harsher measures, a so-called circuit breaker. For now, though, it's all ended in tears. For the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, he's in a tricky position. But then, that's politics at the top of government, and that's not half of it. This week, the B word is back at the top of the PM's in tray, with EU leaders in Brussels trying to work out how a trade deal might work with the UK. Don't forget, Boris Johnson said last month that he wanted to see progress by Thursday, October the 15th. That's this week. So later, I'll be talking to former Brexit Secretary David Davis about whether a deal looks likely or whether, in fact, we're leaving without one. And finally, last week, former BBC journalist Lega Stratton was unveiled as the new press secretary to Boris Johnson when the new televised press conferences get underway. So today I'll be joined by someone who almost got her job, the Telegraph's very own Liam Halligan. But first up, Sir Charles Walker isn't your typical rebel. Yet so far, he's voted against his government 3 times on lockdown measures, which isn't exactly normal for a vice-chairman of the influential 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs. Let's find out why. Sir Charles Walker, one of the 2 vice-chairmen of the 1922 committee. Now, that is the grassroots of the Tory party in Parliament. But why have you rebelled 3 times on COVID-19 restrictions in the past few weeks?
Because I think we're going in the wrong direction at the moment. I'm extremely concerned about many businesses in my constituency and across the country. And if you want to have first world public services, and I certainly do want to have first world public services, you've got to have a first world economy. You can't have one without the other. And my fear is that the path we're on will damage our economy for years and potentially decades to come and reduce everybody's living standards and quality of life.
There's been 3 rebellions so far amongst the Tory backbenchers, increasing in number from 7 MPs to 12 to 42 this week. Now, we saw this pattern emerging during the Brexit drama of the past 2 years. How damaging do you think this will be to the party and to discipline in Parliament?
Well, I hope it's not damaging, because people aren't doing it because they just want to be awkward for the sake of being awkward. So the rebellion last week, when 42 colleagues voted against the government, earlier this week, on Monday, when 42 colleagues voted against the government, was around the 10 p.m. curfew. Many colleagues, including myself, can't understand the logic of the 10 p.m. curfew. There doesn't seem to be any reason for it. Why 10 p.m.? Why not 9:45 p.m. or 10:15 p.m.? And actually, if the government had basically said, well, let's make it 11 p.m., I think many colleagues would have been satisfied with that, because that would allow restaurants, for example, to get 2 sittings in.
Well, the point of 10 p.m. is that's the point at which you're probably 3 pints in and you start to embrace friends and colleagues, Charles, not you personally, but a drinker.
Well, that's a natural human emotion, to embrace friends and colleagues. And I think colleagues are also concerned, my parliamentary colleagues, about the level of coercion around the way we're trying to control this virus. Often ministers thank the British public for making sacrifices. They're not making sacrifices. They're being coerced by the law to change the way they conduct themselves. And actually criminalising grandparents for seeing their grandchildren is something that causes me and many other people, not just in Parliament, but around the country, a huge amount of concern. And I just don't believe it's the right way of doing things.
Well, we're speaking now just as London is going to go into the Tier 2 category this weekend, and that'll ban mixed households in bars, and you can only get together in more than one household in private gardens and outdoor spaces. Will you vote against that if it's put to Parliament?
I'm afraid I would. I just think there's a different way of doing this, a way that looks after people, but also ensures that the economy can generate employment opportunities and the wealth we need to fund public services. So we can ask the elderly, by all means, we can advise the elderly to manage their risk, to stay at home, not to see their grandparents, but we shouldn't be compelling them to do that. If someone wants to see a grandchild and they can manage the risk and they can quantify the risk, we should allow them to do that. And so, for example, with people with underlying health conditions, of course, I don't want to see them forced back into the workplace, but we could have a package of support that would allow people at risk with diabetes or heart disease of working age to stay at home, to work from home. And if they can't work from home, to ensure they have an income while they're at home. And as for the NHS, surely that we can save the people within the NHS by ensuring that those NHS workers most at risk with underlying health conditions are not put on the front line in the same way they were in March and April when we knew less about this disease. So I do think there's a different approach, and that's it's not an approach that says let the disease rip. It's an approach that says this is probably going to be with us for a long time. It's endemic in society. We've actually got to learn to manage and live with it.
So the students in Liverpool who were caught this week on camera celebrating the last night before the Tier 3 restrictions came in, you would say, just carry on partying, kids, but don't go and see your grandparents. You put it on the individual, wouldn't you?
I mean, young people have worked out, because they're rational actors, young people have worked out that this disease poses virtually no risk to them at all health-wise, but they're the group being actually asked to make the biggest sacrifices. Let's be clear here. It's their jobs that are going. It's their education that's being interrupted. And I get really cross when I see well-heeled, middle-aged people, largely paid out of the public purse, sneering and criticizing young people for doing what young people do.
Yes, and you can understand entirely why young people want to go out, want to party.
Of course. I was young once. I might now be a terrible old fogey in my 50s, but I do remember what it was like to be young. And we've just got to stop demonizing youngsters for doing what young people do. It really is a very, very unattractive thing to do from people who are established, comfortable, generally pretty well off, and have their pensions funded out of the public purse, bluntly.
You say we, I'm afraid to say it's your government. Do you think your government's lost the plot?
Well, no, I'm not going to say the government is, this is a fiendishly difficult thing to do. And look, I think the tier system is the best of a bad lot. It wouldn't be my preferred outcome, but it's certainly better than what Sir Keir Starmer is recommending, which is to lock down the economy, lock down the country, condemn yet more people to a life of unemployment, to foregoing opportunity, more family businesses going to the wall, more big businesses laying people off. A brewer in the north of England, over 2,000 today. This is not a humane response. It's not a sensible response. And let's be clear, the virus is endemic. Locking down for 3 weeks is just going to be like turning down a wood-burning stove to slumber. The wood will smolder away. It's not going to burn itself out. When you turn the wood-burning stove on in the morning, the wood ignites again. So this is not a long-term solution. This is a solution that is going to condemn millions and millions of people to a lot of misery and unhappiness.
Who's in charge of the government's response to the COVID-19 crisis? Is it the PM or his advisors? And by that, I mean the scientific advisors.
Scientists advise and governments decide. I think if any mistake was made, it was at the outset saying we're going to be led by the science.
Yeah.
Look, scientists are not responsible for raising armies, for paying pensions, for funding teachers, for financing the NHS. They don't have any of those complexities. Scientists deal with science, yeah? Black and white normally. But government is a much more colourful challenge. So by all means, take the science into account, but also take other voices into account. Now, it seems to me that the government scientific advisors, through natural selection, are those that are at the most cautious bent when it comes to managing this disease. And there's a whole range of scientific opinion from well-respected scientists that says, hold on, there is another way of doing this, but they're not the ones round the table.
Are you amazed about the government not publishing the economic analysis of the damage caused by, say, a circuit breaker or even Tier 3? There's no balance against what Sage tell us in their minutes published this week from September the 21st against what the other side of the balance sheet should be.
I don't think the economic consequences of what we're doing have been explained and therefore are understood.
What are they, Charles Walker? What are they?
Mass unemployment, for a start, an economy that could be hobbled for decades, debts and deficit of unimaginable scale, putting the very future of this country's ability to operate at risk. Now, the only comfort one can draw from this is that the rest of the Western world has chosen to follow this path. But it does put the Western world in huge, huge jeopardy. It'll take great courage to say, and I appreciate it'll take great political courage to say, actually, we've got to do things differently. We've got to look after the vulnerable, but get this economy up and running again, moving, so we can continue to enjoy the things that we can enjoy. Perfectly legitimate for the Prime Minister to say, look, Charles, you're a backbencher. Of course, you're entitled to a view, but I've got to run the country and make difficult decisions. Yeah. Now, I think it's incumbent on me and others to challenge the Prime Minister in the making of those decisions. Personally, I'm glad it's a Conservative Prime Minister making them as opposed to a Labour Prime Minister. But as a Conservative, it would be completely wrong of me just to say, right, that's it. I'm going to go along with everything and we're just going to have to suck it and see. Because I spend a lot of time as a Member of Parliament, as I know many of my colleagues do, talking to business people, small business people who built their business up over decades or generations, and it's all going to the wall. That's it. All their hard work, 50, 60 years, 30, 40 years gone.
And that is hard work. That is hard work doing that.
The problem is a lot of these decisions are being made by people who have no experience of the private sector, who have worked, yes, I'm sure with great diligence in the public sector, but have never worried about paying their staff at the end of the month, balancing the books. And I suspect that a lot of the people making these decisions don't really have any friends who work in the private sector either. Does that make sense?
It does completely.
Don't really have any knowledge of what it takes to grow and build a business.
We don't know this, Charles, but it's a point to make.
Well, I don't know it, but I'm strongly suspecting it's the case when I see how easily the wealth creators in my constituency, the small businesses, their concerns are being dismissed.
Can I ask you a difficult question, Charles Walker?
Yes, you always ask me difficult questions. That's your job.
If you look back over the past 4 years, would it have been better if Boris Johnson had managed the Brexit process and Theresa May was managing the response to COVID-19?
You get the Prime Minister that you get. That's a very, very nice try. I'm enormously fond of them both. I remain incredibly fond of Theresa May. And I love being around Prime Minister Johnson. I love his enthusiasm, energy, and good humour. He has a lot of support on the backbenches. If Boris was to say, right, now's the time to do things differently, I'm not shutting the economy down, I'm not condemning millions of people to the threat of unemployment, we've got to look after the vulnerable, look after the elderly, look after NHS workers who are vulnerable, I think he'd find there would be a huge amount of support, not just on our benches, but quietly on the Labour benches. You will know in that division of 42 MPs, there were over 20 Labour MPs as well. And the Labour Party is still the party, as we are, of the working man and working woman. And many of my Labour colleagues are as concerned and horrified as I am, and my colleagues are, at the thought of mass unemployment, opportunity for Garn, and young people bearing the price of this pandemic.
Charles Walker, Sir Charles Walker, Vice Chairman of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Tory MPs. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics with sobering comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, stay with us. In just a moment, I'll be talking to former Brexit Secretary David Davis about whether to deal or no deal. Right after this. From me. Hello, listeners. I'm Christopher Hope, interrupting your podcast listening to tell you about another show I know you'll enjoy. It's called A Trump Card, and it's a 3-part series with a man who understands President Trump better than most, his friend Nigel Farage.
Wow, what a job he did, Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Farage has been to the White House more than many world leaders.
He then shook me by the hand. He said, thank you, thank you. He said, you will be my friend for life.
So who better to tell us what Donald Trump is like when the cameras are off?
You're dealing with somebody who, if he thinks you're a friend, he becomes a friend of yours.
And as another unpredictable election draws near, what's his trump card? Search the Trump card wherever you're listening to this podcast, or go to telegraph.co.uk/Trump card. And we're back. And so is Brexit. As this week's European Summit in Brussels wraps up and the UK hurdles past the 15th of October deadline for making progress, what should Boris Johnson do now? To get a deal, or to carry on into the brave new world outside the EU without one? And who better to debate that than a former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, who joins me now on this week's show. David Davis, welcome to Choppers Politics. I hope you're okay and enjoying this difficult weather and this appalling time with this pandemic. Now, as if life wasn't bad enough, Brexit is rearing its head again. You were the Brexit Secretary from 2016 to 2018. How does it feel for you now we're getting so near the deadline of this finally happening, of getting some degree of deal or no deal at all?
Well, I mean, frankly, Chris, it's all pretty much as you could have predicted. As I used to say, you will remember in the old days, the first 3 years matters less than the last 3 weeks.
Yes.
And that's what we're witnessing, that the actual movement, the only movement, frankly, in the negotiation has been very recently after the government went in for some hardball politics on the international law issue and said we would repudiate some elements of the withdrawal deal. It was only then, really, that things started to move. And this is absolutely normal for the European Union. They typically go right down to the wire. They even have a mechanism they use when they slightly miscalculate and overrun the wire, and that's called stopping the clock. So the fact is, we are still quite a way away from the end, and I would be unsurprised if we got a lot closer to it, if not right to it, before we got a decision.
When is the end? Because Boris Johnson said he wanted to get some significant way forward this week. Number 10 say they're going to appraise the situation on Friday of this week. Do you think they'll go right until December before we get any sign of a deal, or none at all?
Well, it could be. I mean, what Boris is trying to do, quite properly, is put a bit of pressure on the European side. I mean, frankly, throughout most of the negotiation, we haven't done enough of that. So that's the right thing to do. But let's imagine it all stalls and we haven't got a conclusion this weekend. We will continue to prepare for no deal, which I hope we've been doing for the last year anyway. But we'll continue to prepare for that. But if the Europeans then come back and say, well, how about this option or that option? We're not going to stop talking to them. We're not going to sort of just shut the door and say, go away, we're not talking to you anymore. So the idea that this is the end of the negotiation is, I think, fanciful. Just imagine for a second that the summit, as it were, comes to a series of conclusions on fishing and on mutual standards, on tariff-free trade and so on. In so doing, each side will probably make some concessions. Indeed, the Europeans will have to make some concessions, because if they don't, we won't get a deal. Now, let's imagine they make a concession on some elements of fishing and they decide that with us by this weekend. Well, what's going to happen? The Portuguese or the French or the Danes or whoever it is that's lost out will come back and say, no, we can't do that. So if you finish too early, you convince your own side you haven't fought hard enough, and you effectively invite them to unpick the deal that you've maybe done with a great deal of pressure and a great deal of time. The best thing I could hope for is for us, as it were, to go into the tunnel in the next week. That is when they basically stop communicating, rather than actually get a conclusion. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I don't think I will be.
So we may not see any white smoke of a deal until maybe next month or nearly in the week before Christmas.
That's right.
What do you think the deal might look like? Will we get the right deal for us on fish, and we have to try and give some more away on level playing field on the way that the two economies can compete with state aid?
Well, state aid, I think state aid is a little bit of a sort of false argument, really. At the end of the day, we use state aid less than any other country in Europe. I think it's the case that Dominic Cummings is a big fan of subsidising various industries. But, picking winners never worked in this country. Various Labour governments of the past tried it. It always failed. So, I wouldn't die in a ditch over...
But fish, you would die in a ditch with water in, or for fish, wouldn't you?
Die in the North Sea for fish. I mean,
fish matters. It's got this emotional pull for Britons, I think.
Fish matters, but, there are things like time that you can use, whether we give some sort of arrangements to allow...
Yes.
Look, you've got a lot of people, perfectly decent people, Spaniards and Danes and others, who have invested large amounts of money in ships and so on, fishing vessels, that are fishing in our waters. And if we said, right, January the 1st, go home, that's it, we'll sink you.
Yeah.
That's not British,
it's not going to happen either, is it? I mean, there must be a taper,
exactly. We haven't got a fleet to replace them with yet. I mean, that's going to come. So we have a little bit of time to play with, in which we're doing the honourable thing, but also standing by our own people. So long as we don't make long-term concessions, sort of say, give away the right to allocation to our fish forever, which was the big issue, then I think there are small areas where we can make some sensible agreements. I wouldn't even call them concessions, because frankly, if we weren't in this negotiation, I would argue that we shouldn't treat people's property rights unfairly. We should just make sure that the British fisherman got his right, total rights back at the time when he can make use of them.
Yeah. We've kind of approached this, the squeaky bum time, to quote Alex Ferguson about Brexit. It's almost crept up on us because of all the COVID crisis. Do you think that's because Brexit wasn't really as big an issue as it was made out to be by those who didn't want us to leave, in the sense that Brexit was a row about trade, frankly, and maybe a bit of sovereignty, and that's about it?
Well, I've always thought it's important, but I do think sometimes people have blown up both economic benefits and economic disasters, as it were. I've never thought it would be an economic disaster for a very simple reason, and that is, if everything in the negotiation went wrong and we ended up not just with tariffs, but actually in a trade war, our economy is over 80% services, and if we have to help our own manufacturing, this is me reversing what I said on state aid a minute ago, but you got to a position where the European Union was acting to damage our manufacturing industry, then we would have enough economic resources to correct that when it came down to it. That's not something I would willingly do, but if in the absolute worst outcome, we could help out our own industries.
You don't fear a trade war. Do you fear a no deal?
I don't fear it. I think it would be silly for both sides, frankly, particularly for the Europeans. Remember, always they sell us twice as much as we sell them, and that's not a small amount of money. It's about 100 billion a year surplus, very silly for them. It's very profitable business. Quite a lot of our markets are the most profitable markets in Europe. They keep trying to argue that, but I'm afraid it's true. Let me just do a simple back of envelope sum for you. If we end up with a 10% tariff on cars, what would happen? Well, firstly, the pound will go down. Now, the pound's already gone down by 10% since the referendum. And then probably another 10, so it'd be down 20, right? So if you're a Mercedes manufacturer or a German car manufacturer selling from Germany into Britain, you'd be facing a 10% tariff plus the extra expense of the devalued pound, right? We're going the other way and selling a British car into Germany. Well, we'd be selling the 10% tariff minus 20% on. Now, it's oversimplified, but it gives you the idea. Essentially, because we've got a floating pound, because we weren't daft enough to go into the euro, we would actually have a bit of a buffer. So I think from the manufacturing point of view, we are in a better position than they are. Neither of us would gain from it, but it's a better position than they are.
What odds would you give on a deal?
Oh, what I've always thought, really, sort of 70-30 in favour. Let me make it a little more accurate than that. 50-50 on a comprehensive free trade deal, Canada plus, that phrase I coined.
Your phrase. That's your phrase.
But then it was, President Tusk then took it on, and promised it before they then started backtracking. A bit better than 50% chance of that, and probably a 25% chance of a load of micro deals. If we can't actually do a full proper deal, we get to the end of December, they think, right, okay, well, let's do a separate deal on this and a separate deal, a load of micro deals to make it all work, so that the tunnel doesn't block up or whatever. So I think basically the strong majority of probability is that we will be doing business with the Europeans on January the 1st on a tenable and reasonably stable basis, and a small probability that we are having to cope with, as I say, tariffs and so on. But we're big enough and prosperous enough country to deal with that. And I think, if anything, the odds on a deal of one sort or another will improve, oddly, the more difficult coronavirus is for everybody. Because if we have another year of handicapped trade from coronavirus, everybody will be desperate for free trade, desperate for it. And we'll be in a very good position. It also puts us in a very good position with all the other things, the Trans-Pacific trade arrangements and all that, and the trade with the Americans and so on. So I think, in truth, the odds, if anything, are improving, not reducing.
Boris Johnson is waking up on Friday morning after EU leaders are meant to discuss the Brexit deal over dinner on Thursday night this week. Given he is undoubtedly a listener to this podcast, what's your advice to him?
Be calm, Boris. Be calm. I mean, whatever comes out, and bear in mind that what comes out of these summits is invariably everybody's propaganda, right? So whatever comes out, you're on track for a deal. Your negotiator, David Frost, has done a very good job, actually. I sort of wish I'd had him working for me.
Yes.
But, he's done a very good job. I think, broadly speaking, you're in a good place. If I was the Prime Minister, what I'd focus most on? I mean, the deal's obviously important, but I would focus on making absolutely sure that the Treasury has done everything. And by the Treasury, I also mean HMRC, the Tax and Customs Boys, have done everything possible to make every small business ready for January.
Yeah.
That, for me, is nearly as important as the deal.
And we saw a warning on that this week, didn't we? And just finally, in 2030, 10 years hence, when you're in your dotage, maybe still an MP, how will we look back on Brexit? Will we be pleased? I think 10 years is enough time to give it a fair historical judgment.
It will turn out to have been less scary than everybody thought. There will be things we didn't foresee. I mean, for example, we haven't talked about what happens if we have a Biden victory in the States. That could give us an interesting bump along the way. But Britain will be standing taller in the world than they have done for 20 years or so. I mean, I'm very proud of my country. But one of the things that always used to surprise me, even though I'm very proud of my country, was when I was a Foreign Office Minister and I went abroad on behalf of the government, how highly regarded we were, even by countries who may have reason not to like us, how highly regarded we were in terms of what we stand for, whether it's free trade, democracy, freedom of speech and so on, but also how powerful people think we are. I mean, I pinch myself sometimes when I come back to the Middle East. Every country in the Middle East seems to think we're pulling all the strings, which has not been true for 50 years. But, nevertheless, we are a well-regarded country and we will be more well-regarded in 2030. David
Davis, former Brexit Secretary and, an architect maybe of this Brexit deal about to happen, maybe. Let's see. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, coming up next...
Excuse me, Liam, what are you doing? I know you've got rather used to being the podcast host, but you're the guest on this one.
I thought this was Planet Normal. Oh, sorry, Chris, this is your podcast. I got a bit carried away.
Right, thank you. Yes, Liam. Now, as I was about to say, this week, Westminster's gossip columns were full of feverish speculation about the shortlist to become the PM's first ever press secretary. The job eventually went to former journalist Allegra Stratton. But somebody else in the running for that was my next guest, Liam Halligan, economist and co-host of my second favourite Telegraph podcast, alongside columnist Alison Pearson, Planet Normal. Liam Halligan, not the PM's press secretary, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chopper. It's nice to be here.
How do you feel about missing out to Allegra Stratton?
Well, I was never going to get the job. It was always going to be Allegra's job if she wanted it. Downing Street wanted to appoint a female spokesperson, and that's their call. And she's very well connected with Boris and his inner circle, and that's fair enough.
Was that made clear to you about hiring a female press secretary?
No, of course it wasn't, because that wouldn't have been right and proper, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the reality. But that's fine. I never expected to get the job, and I never even thought about applying for the job, really, even though it's pretty obvious from my background that I might have been a contender. I've been a broadcaster for many years, obviously written a column in the Telegraph for about 20 years. And as you know, even though I'm mainly an economics writer, I used to be a member of the lobby as a political correspondent for the FT.
And also, most importantly, you actually like the idea of Brexit.
Well, yeah, and I wrote a book about Brexit, didn't I?
Right.
And I've recently written another book called Home Truths on Housing, which is another big area that the government wants. But no, I wasn't even really thinking of applying because I knew it was a done deal. But, you know, quite a few people at the top of politics and even at the top of government said, why don't you apply and come and have a chat? So I thought, yeah, why not? It would be interesting, if nothing else.
Of course. And given it's only you and me talking and no one's listening, who actually gave you the ring in the first place, Liam? Was it a tousle-haired PM?
I'm not going to disclose that, but you know the kind of people that I know in government, and you know, Chris, that if you do our kind of job, part of the job isn't to befriend people in government, and even, you know, in the opposition front bench too, where I've got lots and lots of contacts. Our job is to have access to the people who make decisions, so we can report on the decisions that they make, so we can anticipate the decisions that they make. And naturally, when you've been doing this job for as long as I have, it often goes the other way. You know that's how it works. People ring you up at the top of government and say, well, what would you do? What do you think? And that is kind of how politics, particularly the commentary part of politics, which I've specialised in recent years, as opposed to the reporting part of politics, the more honest part of politics that you've specialised in, that is how it works. And I don't think that's a necessarily bad thing. And if you're someone like me who's, you know, I started out as an academic, I'm a policy specialist, then I think there's nothing wrong with that when people ask you what you think, and that eventually means sometimes that they want you to work with them.
OK, so let's get to the nuts and bolts, Liam Halligan. They've cleared away a room in number 9 Downing Street. That's to the right of the famous black door, number 10, as you look at it. Paint a picture of what it's like to stand at that podium. Were there strong lights on you, and who was in the audience asking you questions during your interview?
Well, yeah, there is a podium. It's quite impressive. It's obviously, it should be. It's designed to be beamed around the world as a representation of the government of the, you know, the 5th or 6th biggest economy on earth. But when I was there, it was all still a bit, you know, very much a work in progress. You could see the bare bones of it, and the lectern was there. And I'm afraid in the audience, it wasn't grizzled hacks like yourself, Chris. There was no Peston and Koonsberg. It was basically a bunch of bright young things and special advisors who work in Downing Street. And there was no quarter. I mean, look, they gave me a 50-page dossier, and then they said, right, you got 30 minutes and then you're on. And the dossier was full of very, you know, tightly worded policy briefs and all the rest of it.
Did you know? That sounds terrifying.
I really enjoy it. I'm a policy wonk. I love the detail. That's always how I've been. And when in my period in the lobby, I was always absolutely amazed about how little, you know, these so-called frontline journalists actually knew about policies. Often they knew almost nothing. But I really enjoyed the experience, I must say. And at the end, there was somebody at the back of the room waving their arm around like a windmill, which basically in TV land means wind up, wind up. And I'm like, well, I'm having a good laugh at this. And so I really enjoyed it. And the questions that the young advisors were putting to me were well put. And I tried to keep it detailed and factual, and I think I did for the most part. But I also tried to have a bit of fun and bring some levity into the proceedings, because, you know, that's what Allegra's going to have to do. She will become a sort of mainstream figure in her own right, and you have to demonstrate some of your personality. You have to show humour and humanity when you do this job, and I guess that's, in my little trial run, that's what I tried to do.
Liam Halligan, what's your advice to Allegra Stratton? I mean, do you think this idea might backfire? You know how these stories can take hold in a day. Let's assume we're in peacetime, as I call it, outside of the COVID assault. Stories then can rapidly escalate through a day with a minister on the run. Is it wise to have a daily press spokesman at 5 p.m. on what would be primetime TV if the story was big enough?
Well, I think the government's been increasingly frustrated with the mainstream media, and I understand some of those frustrations, but also the mainstream media is becoming less and less important, and alternative media and social media is becoming more and more important. So the government has the opportunity to shape its own narrative, and that's what these daily press briefings are all about. And when I heard about them, I was instantly supportive of them on Twitter. I also think a lot of the Westminster journalists in particular have made fools of themselves over recent months and years, as the public has seen actually how little they know.
Well,
how little they know. It's all about gaffes and splits and U-turns, and people are throwing things at the television, Chris, saying, Get me some information. It's not about you and your next chat show and your Twitter followers. It's really got on everyone's nerves.
Yeah.
And so I think this will change the dynamic. I don't think that the journalists who try and grandstand are going to be the most successful. I think it's journalists who have real knowledge and can winkle out information that are going to be the most successful. And what I'd say to Allegra, for whom I have a lot of respect, and I do wish her luck, and I don't mean that in a snarky sense at all, she knows, firstly, never lie. Not that you'd want to anyway, but, don't take risks with the truth when you're under enormous pressure. Some of the most intelligent sentences in the English language begin with the words, I don't know. If you don't know, say you don't know. And also make sure, apart from being always truthful and injecting some personality into it, make sure, and she knows this, you're in the room, right? When decisions are being made, when strategy meetings are being held, you have to be in the room because then you can see where the decision might go. So when you're put under pressure, you can take a split-second decision to cede a little bit more ground or go slightly further because that's where the government's going anyway. And in the heat of the moment, that might be the way to limit the damage.
I've got to ask you, Liam Halligan, that one of the first questions asked to one of the new White House press secretaries was, would you ever lie for the president? Now, if you were asked, would you ever lie for Boris Johnson, how would you have responded to that?
No way. I mean, Chris, you've known me a long time. I'm not really a party political person. I've always been... the great Sam Britton died earlier this week. He was a huge influence on me and I was honoured to know. And he once said to me over one of our many lunches over the years when he was encouraging my column writing, the left-wing, right-wing labels are infantile and they're not part of any sensible policy debate. And my God, the public, for the most part, feels that. And my God, we forget that at Westminster. So I wouldn't lie for any government. What I would do behind closed doors is impart some home truths, if you like, and tell them what I think they're getting wrong. And indeed, that's what I did when they interviewed me.
And because you could say that, couldn't you? Because you'd be the person taking a flak for their policies. So it would give you, Allegra Stratton, in this case, a buy-in into those policies. Can I just ask you, when you're being questioned in number 9 in the interview, did any of the staff there pretend to be journalists and say they were Laura Kuenssberg or Robert Peston?
They didn't actually use the names, but it was clear that they'd been watching the journalistic starlets, if you like, on television and were trying to emulate some of their mannerisms a little bit. And depending on the angle of the question, I sometimes pretended to make fun of the paper that they were working for, or that I could assume that they were working for, given what neck of the woods they were coming from. But no, the youngsters who asked the questions were absolutely, that they were brilliant. And I certainly enjoyed it despite the pressure that they put me under.
Well, Liam Halligan, the presenter of Planet Normal, Not Choppers podcast, and maybe in future an advisor to the PM. Let's see. But for now, a brilliant economist. Thank you, Liam Halligan. Thank you.
Cheers, Chris.
And do please give Planet Normal a listen. It's terrific. Liam presents it weekly with Alison Pearson, a fellow Telegraph columnist. You can find it wherever you listen to this podcast or click on the link in the show notes to this episode. And that's all for today's episode. Thank you to my guests this week, David Davis, Sir Charles Walker, and our very own Liam Halligan. Thanks to my producers this week, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Loulidis. If you enjoy the show, I'd be so grateful if you can leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. That's what Mains did this week. They said, we are one of the best podcasts out there, particularly enjoyed the recent Nigel Farage series, Insight on Donald Trump. Keep up the fine work, Chopper, smiley face. Well, thank you so much, Mains. I'll do my best. Happy face. And if you want to listen to that series mentioned there, it's called The Trump Card. And you can find it here on your Choppers Politics feed, or go to telegraph.co.uk/Trump Card. Now, as you probably guessed, podcasts like this one take time. And time, as you know and I know, means money. So please consider supporting our journalism. You can get your first 30 days access to the Telegraph's content free by going to telegraph.co.uk/Chopper. And after that, we're a bargain £2 a week. And of course, if you want to get in touch, please email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. And finally, as ever, always, if you can, buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, cheerio!